Today we're going to make one of my favorite vegan meals using spaghetti squash. This is a spaghetti squash, and you might have seen this scary yellow item at the grocery store before. And some people like to think of it as low-carb pasta, but personally I hate when food lies to me, so I just like to appreciate it for what it is, as a spaghetti squash. The hardest part about dealing with a spaghetti squash is cutting it, but today we're going to cut it, cook it, and make it into a nice meal. There are two ways you can cut the squash. If you cut it this way, you'll get longer squash noodles, and it will be easier to cut, but it will also take longer to cook. The reason you get longer squash noodles if you cut it this way is because the squash fibers that turn into noodles wind around the circumference of the squash. If you cut it lengthwise, it's harder to cut and you'll get shorter noodles, but it will cook a little bit faster. Also, if you cut it lengthwise, your squash will end up with a much nicer tan, so I'm going to cut it lengthwise. Spaghetti squash has a bad reputation because it's so hard to cut, but I'm going to cut it without losing any fingers. To make it a little bit easier, I'm going to poke some holes in it along the part that I'm going to cut, and then I'm going to microwave it for 3 minutes to soften it up a little bit. The specific microwave softening time depends on your microwave and the size of your squash, but I've found that the sweet spot is anywhere between 3 to 5 minutes. If you don't care about the squash's texture, you can go ahead and cook it all the way through in the microwave. After the squash is done in the microwave, I like to wait about 15 minutes to let it cool down to a more comfortable handling temperature. If you're struggling to cut your squash, or if you don't want to soften the squash in the microwave, stand on a stool or move the squash to a cutting board to a lower surface so that you can really lean your weight into the squash. One of the downsides of softening the squash in the microwave is that it might break or crack a little bit, and if that happens, that's totally fine. Your squash will still taste great. Once the squash is cut, it's time to start preheating the oven. I like to cook my squash at 350 degrees. As you can see, there are seeds and stringy things inside the squash, and these are not the spaghetti squash noodles. Let's use a spoon and scrape all of this stuff out, and if you'd like, you can save the seeds and toast them like pumpkin seeds. Next, I coat the spaghetti squash with olive oil and massage it to spread the olive oil all over the squash surface. The olive oil adds to the flavor, and it helps the seasoning to better stick onto the squash. The spaghetti squash has a pretty neutral taste on its own, so I like to sprinkle salt, garlic, and a lot of pepper onto the surface. If you like spicy food, you can also consider adding chili flakes. Once the squash is dressed, I put it face down on parchment paper and put it in the oven. I usually cook spaghetti squash between 20 to 45 minutes at 350 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the size of the squash. For this particular squash, I'm going to estimate that it needs to cook for about 23 minutes. It's been about 23 minutes now, so let's check the squash. The top of the squash should feel soft, but not necessarily too squishy, and that's how you know it's done cooking. If the squash is done, you can let it cool down for a bit so that it's easier to handle, and if it needs more time, you can put it back in the oven for about 10 more minutes and then check it again. And now let's prepare our sauce. I don't eat beef and I'm not a fan of meatballs, but I absolutely love these Gardein vegan meatballs. But once again, I hate when food lies to me, so let's call them flavored protein balls. My preferred way of cooking these flavored protein balls is to follow the stovetop directions on the packaging, and I heat up red pasta sauce to a gentle simmer, and then I add in the balls for about 15 minutes. While the sauce and the balls are cooking, we can get back to the squash. Before handling the squash, make sure that it has cooled down to a safe temperature to where you feel comfortable handling the squash. To change the squash into the spaghetti form, I use a fork to scrape it along the shorter part of the squash. Then I just keep scraping out the noodles and putting them into a big bowl. Once I've successfully hollowed out both sides of the squash, I like to use 2 forks to mix it all up. As you might have noticed, the seasoning was concentrated on the surface of the squash, so I mix it all up to try to evenly distribute it so that no one ends up with a fork full of pepper. Now let's combine the spaghetti squash and the flavored protein ball sauce, and it's finally time to enjoy this delicious meal.